In this episode of Explaining Russia, you will learn what Russia was in the past and why there is always a huge controversy regarding Russia's historical greatness, what its people were like, and why Vladimir Lenin, when talking about Russia, said, "We seized power in a country populated by half-savage or totally savage people."
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
Russia's past was admirable, its present is more than magnificent, and as for its future, it is beyond anything that the boldest mind can imagine. It is from this point of view that Russian history must be viewed and written. This famous quote regarding Russian historiography belongs to Alexander von Benkendorf, who, as the head of the Russian secret police, became known for establishing and overseeing strict censorship in Russia during the reign of Emperor Nicholas I. 200 years later, Russia no longer has emperors, at least officially, but overall the country still seems to live by the very same principles, although now formulated not in such exquisite words as Benkendorf's, but in dull bureaucratic language. This small excerpt is from a decree recently signed by Vladimir Putin on the fundamentals of the state policy in the field of historical enlightenment. The reason for the new decree is the same as it was 200 or 300 years ago: unfriendly foreign powers who diminish or simply refuse to recognize Russia's historical contributions to the development of world civilization. Putin's decree starts with a definition of Russia, and I think this can be a perfect topic for the first video on this channel, to discuss Russia and its so-called moral and cultural values, which according to the document have become the basis for Russia's enormous contribution to global development. I also suggest that we start by defining the terms and definitions. What is Russia? How many years has Russia existed? Where is it located? I believe that Russia, whose civilized history could possibly be discussed in the context of any significant cultural or human values of any kind, is actually a very short-lived country. Its history lasted for exactly 155 years, from 1762 to 1917. The year 1917 marked the Socialist Revolution and the collapse of the Russian Empire, after which, up until today, the words cultural and human values became nothing more than a joke on Russian territory. And 1762 is the year when, after several decades of one after another rather questionable Russian empresses of half-German origin, Princess Sophie Augusta Frederica von Anhalt-Zerbst, who was ethnically 100% German, ascended the Russian throne and became the Russian Empress. She ruled the country for a long time, reigning for 34 years, and went down in history as Catherine II, or Catherine the Great. It was she and her descendants who consistently married only German and sometimes Danish princesses. It was under their reign that the Russian Empire existed and developed for 155 years. And if you don't agree with such approach, just try to name a historically significant person or development in Russia before Catherine the Great. Any Russian writer before the Catherine the Great era, before the German Denis van Wiesen, any poet before Gavril Державин, any scientist, just anyone, even someone like the so-called Russian mathematician Leonard Euler, or Russian explorers Vitus Bering, Adam Johann von Krusenstern, and Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen. Even this kind of Russian would work. Just name anyone or anything significant that is related to art, science, culture, or education. There isn't anything. You can even consider anything related to the triumphs of Russian arms and the empire's territorial expansion. Of course, nowadays we have a different point of view on this, so call it conquest, annexation, enslavement, or acquisition of new territories, but this doesn't change its essence. And no, I'm not talking about Russia's expansion to the east with its vast empty territories populated by wild tribes. I mean the West, right bank Ukraine, southern Ukraine and Bessarabia, the Caucasus, Transcaucasia, Poland, the Baltic states and Finland. All those territories were once added to Russia under Catherine and her descendants. Before that, there was nothing really significant, absolutely nothing that could possibly be discussed in the context of Russia's significant role or contribution to the development of world civilization, in particular European civilization. And now that we have set the time frame, let's talk about geography. The thing is, there was not one but three Russias existing at the same time. 3 significantly different Russias within the borders of one country. This is precisely what makes discussing Russia's historical past so complex and leads to frequent mistakes or sometimes deliberate manipulations. Because anyone can take examples, numbers, or historical facts from the life of one of these 3 Russias, which differed extensively, and then build whatever comparison and conclusions they want. Let's look at this map taken from the results of the 1897 Russian Empire census, the first and only census conducted in the Russian Empire. Here on the population density map, we see that back then there was a gigantic territory to the east of the Ural Mountains, Siberia and Russian Far East, which were virtually uninhabited. The small dark brown spots on this map represent a population density similar to the United States of that time period. Back then in the USA there lived slightly fewer than 90 million people in a vast territory. So even when compared with the population density of the US, a virtually empty country at the time, we see only a few small areas in this part of Russia with brown or dark brown shading showing a comparable population. The rest of the territory has a density of 1 to 5 people per square kilometer, or even less than 1, meaning it was simply a lifeless desert. But this is the Asian part of Russia. There was also the European part. So here is the map of population density in the European part of Russia, and I suggest we take a look at these areas. First of all, since we are talking about Russia and the Russians' contribution to human civilization, for the purpose of our analysis, I'm leaving out the Kingdom of Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Bessarabia, and Caucasus. I'm only considering the territories populated by what the 1897 census called Russians in general, which consisted of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Here I'm not discussing the correctness of such a grouping, I'm only using it in accordance with the historiographical approach of Vladimir Putin and his believers. Now let's take a look at this table showing the average population density in other countries during approximately the same time period. There is absolutely no sense in comparing Russia with the numbers from the UK, Italy or Germany, so let's compare it with these 2 countries, Austria-Hungary and France. Both had large territories and, similar to Russia, a significant agricultural industry. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular could be a good comparison. A huge country back then that, in addition to Austria and Hungary, included the territories of modern Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia and Croatia. One of Europe's major powers at the time, Austria-Hungary was geographically the 2nd largest country in Europe. So, even comparing with the population density of the immense and spacious Austro-Hungarian Empire, it appears that the European Russia wasn't that big at all. We can see that the areas with moderate European population density, again not the density of Germany or England, but the density of spacious Austria-Hungary or France, could only be seen in the territory of modern Ukraine, the so-called Central Black Earth region, the Moscow region and St. Petersburg, and that's it. Everything else is again just a vast plain over which Russian population slowly spread out over hundreds of years. While beyond the areas marked with a white line, these are practically deserted territories, pretty much just 1 house or 1 household per square kilometer. Notice that even between the 2 capital cities of the empire, Moscow and St. Petersburg, there's practically nothing, just a wide, almost uninhabited territory. So this is how Russia looked back then, with 3 different Russias existing at the same time. Here I think will be a good moment to recall what Vladimir Lenin once said in regards to Russia. We seized power in a country populated by half-savage or even totally savage people. So there was a gigantic, almost uninhabited, deserted territory populated by savage people, to be fair though in very small numbers. Let's call it Russia number 3. There was also a vast plain, practically empty and deserted, with scattered villages here and there. This was Russia number 2. And there was Russia number 1 that lived in the large cities where civilization of a quite a European scale indeed existed. It was in these cities that everything mentioned by Vladimir Putin in his decree was built and created, indeed contributing to world science, culture, art, technology, you name it. Interestingly enough, out of the top 10 largest cities in the Russian Empire, besides Moscow and St. Petersburg, there isn't a single other Russian city. 2 of them are Polish, 3 are Ukrainian, and the remaining 3 are in Latvia, Georgia, and Uzbekistan. Let's take a closer look at this Russia number 1. These are the 25 largest cities of the Russian Empire with a population of at least 100,000 people, more or less. So how big was Russia number 1? Again, for this analysis we are considering only the cities of what later became the Russian Federation, Ukraine and Belarus. And if we count the whole population, we'll see that it's not even 5 million. It's just 4,220,000 people, or just 4% of the total population of the Russian Empire, excluding the Kingdom of Poland and Finland. And this 4% of Russia was indeed where there were magnificent palaces and luxurious mansions, beautiful parks and wide avenues, schools and universities, theaters, large factories and scientific centers. Russia number 1 was building some of the world's first radio stations, steamboats, locomotives, submarines and later even airplanes. This was Europe indeed, a true European country with quite a high level of development. Certainly not the highest, but nevertheless more than worthwhile. This little 5 million population Russia indeed created everything that is deservedly marked in history as a valuable contribution to the development of world civilization. But now let's talk about the quality of life and civilization achievements in the largest part, Russia number 2. That Russia whose large population flowed across the vast Russian plains and was inhabited by what Vladimir Lenin accurately called half-savage people. First, I probably need to explain the use of such harsh words. According to the very same 1897 census of the Russian Empire, at the turn of the 20th century, only 21% of the Russian population was literate. But that's for the whole of Russia. Let's check the European part of the Russian Empire, that is what can be attributed by territorial criteria to modern Russia, and Russia number 2 by the terms of our analysis. In this part of Russia, the literacy rate was slightly higher, though not by much, only 23%. Nearly 20% literacy at the turn of the 20th century is very low, awfully low. This is not even close to the leading Western countries of the time. These were indeed half-savage people. By the way, it is important to note that while in Western countries literacy was defined as the ability to read and write, in the Russian census a person was considered literate if they could at least read. Therefore, it is hard to not agree with Vladimir Lenin and his quote. So why didn't Russians study and why were they in such a bad state? If you'd studied in a Soviet school as I did, you'd have the answer right away. As our beloved Vladimir Lenin said, it was because of the Tsar's oppression that the Russian people were so deprived of education. However, this particular statement of Lenin's as regards the Russian Empire is a bit debatable, because in this very empire the state's expenses on education had risen sevenfold from 1894 to 1914, amounting to 14.6% of total budget expenditures. In this empire, 10,000 schools were opened every year, and by the beginning of 1912, there were 125,000 schools across the country. Schooling in this empire was free of charge and starting from 1908 became compulsory for all children. Yes, it was just a 4-year elementary school, but still an education, free of charge and compulsory. And what was the effect of such financial expenditures? On January 18, 1911, the All-Russian School Census was conducted. On that day, census takers went in every school out of those 125,000 and counted the children in classes. And what they learned was that only 43% of all children entitled to free and compulsory education were attending school in 1911. A few years later, another somewhat smaller survey was conducted which revealed that in rural areas only 28% of school-aged children, that is, children from 8 to 12 years old, were attending school, free and compulsory school. And here arises a big question. Who was holding these people back from studying? Was it really due to the Tsar's oppression alone? This almost non-existent desire for education was just one indicator of Russia number 2, the Russia of half-savage people. And now let's talk about another, perhaps even more important aspect of that country, which is one of the most crucial indicators of quality of life: infant mortality. Well, the fact that infant mortality was monstrously high in the past is understandable. In that time, before vaccinations and antibiotics, it was awfully high. In Russia back then, this number was 270 per 1,000 live births. So at the turn of the 20th century in Russia, of 1,000 children born alive, 270 did not survive to the age of 1. Again, comparing this number to today is of course absolutely incorrect. However, it's okay and even necessary to compare Russia to other countries of that time, and somehow the infant mortality in Russia was almost 2 times higher than in the UK, Italy or France, and almost 4 times higher than in Sweden or Norway. To be fair, the real difference was even worse, as 270 was the average rate not for the entire Russian Empire, but for the 50 most western governorates. Yet even in this region some areas had mortality rates exceeding 400 deaths per 1,000 live births. So what was the cause? Poverty? Starvation? What's starvation? According to the 1913 statistical report, the average yearly grain consumption in Russia was almost 300 kg per person. For reference, a standard adult requires roughly 200 kg per year. Of course, make no mistake, the life of common people in Russia was full of hardships and their nutrition was far from optimal, but with 300 kg of grain per year, talk of starvation is out of the picture entirely. Interestingly enough, the level of grain consumption in Russia was even higher than in England. Speaking of which, in England 78% of the population lived in cities, while in Russia only 13% did. What does this imply? It implies that almost all of the Russian people, all of the rural residents, lived in their own homes. The same goes for a significant part of the urban population. There weren't that many cities in Russia, and those that existed were mostly composed of ordinary one-story wooden houses, even in Moscow and St. Petersburg. As you can understand, a one-story wooden house is not a rental house rented out to multiple families. Thus, in Russia, the majority of families lived in their own house. Meanwhile, in England, 78% of the population, those former peasants pushed into the cities by the Industrial Revolution, lived in congested barracks. Just as Karl Marx described in his work, horrific overcrowding, factory barracks, basements, attics and lofts, dirt, congestion, dampness and lack of fresh air. It was in these conditions that English, French and German children grew up, and somehow they died half as frequently as Russian children, who grew up in the fresh air on green grass in their own houses, surrounded by forests with berries, rivers with fish, and having 300 kg of grain per person per year. And yet Russian infant mortality was 2-3 times higher than in the developed European countries. Why? One might say that this is just a reflection of the so-called Russian traditional values, particularly voiced in popular Russian expressions like «Повыло 2 дня, все, хватит, пора в поле работать». «Бог дал, Бог взял». «Помер Трофим, да и хрен с ним». As simple as that. Died, and who cares? This matter could be addressed from various angles, but let's choose the one that is measurable and thus can be compared to other countries, time periods, and so on. And this indicator, perfectly representing the quality of life of this Russia number 2, the vast and half-savage Russia, was cholera. As you may know, cholera is a highly contagious disease that causes severe intestinal infection. The thing about cholera is that it is transmitted in one specific way. Cholera is not transmitted by mosquitoes like malaria or other tropical diseases. It does not spread through the air like various viral infections. It is not transmitted by inhaling infected droplets like the plague or by skin contact like leprosy, and it is not spread through intimate contact like syphilis. The only mechanism of transmission for cholera from one person to another is the fecal-oral route. In very simple terms, from feces to mouth. Only this way, from human feces to human mouth. That is, you can only get infected with it when people, having contaminated themselves with this very substance, eat with their hands, drink or cook food in water in which another person sick with cholera has previously defecated. Cholera is a kind of stamp, a stamp of quality of life on which is written savagery and backwardness. Simply speaking, cholera is a disease of savagery, which is why nowadays it's not so widespread as it used to be. It is believed that cholera originated in India, however for centuries it remained there, and only in 1830 did it first break out and was brought to Europe with merchant ships. Yes, indeed, the cholera pandemics hit not only Russia but other European countries as well. However, the death toll in Russia appeared to be 10 times higher than in Europe. I'm talking about the great cholera pandemic of the 1830s, the very one that in Russia killed hundreds of thousands of people and caused fierce cholera riots, accompanied by numerous murders of doctors and burnings of hospitals, since ordinary Russians believed that doctors were not saving them but deliberately contaminating smallpox to kill them all. Meanwhile, Europe encountered this disease and fairly quickly discovered that at the very least they must wash their hands and boil water to prevent cholera. As a result, Britain, for example, faced a final cholera epidemic in 1866. A similar picture was seen in other countries as well, as European cities started to improve their sanitation and water systems. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire endured one cholera pandemic after another throughout the entire 19th century and even into the 20th. Cholera simply became a part of life in Russia. In 1892, imagine the end of the 19th century, technological progress was in full swing, Europe was crisscrossed with railways, the first cars were on the streets, light bulbs and electricity were becoming commonplace. Meanwhile, in Russia, yet another massive cholera pandemic struck. 800,000 people got sick, of whom 381,000 died. And it's highly likely that the real numbers were even higher, as it was common practice in Russia to cover up and downplay the severity of such a situation. But even if we trust the official data, the extremely high mortality rate is staggering. Nearly half of those infected died. To further understand this tragedy, let's talk about some basics. What is cholera and how it is treated? Cholera is a bacterium which, on entering the human body, causes severe irritation of the small intestine, leading to large amounts of watery diarrhea, which in severe cases results in rapid death. In simple terms, a person afflicted with cholera dies from dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Nothing more, nothing less. So essentially all that is needed to prevent death is just ample water and salts. Of course, today intravenous therapy and antibiotics are used in severe cases, but in essence a patient can be saved by simply drinking large amounts of salted water. And this is how Russian doctors saved their patients. This is precisely how they did, because they had nothing else at their disposal. And they saved everyone they could. The enormous number of deaths from cholera in Russia, that is, those who could not even get plenty of salted water, indicates a complete lack of sanitation and medical knowledge, insufficient doctors, and total backwardness and barbarity. And again, this is not me exaggerating, this is the exact European wording of that time. Thankfully, there were at least some doctors in Russia who did their best, and they left many accounts of the cholera pandemics of 1892 and 1895. This also includes accounts from foreign doctors and their recollections, particularly regarding the awful unsanitary conditions and backwardness of Russia. Yes, even in the 19th century, the damned Europeans and Americans were coming in to save Russians. But I know, the foreigners' recollections are always wrong, biased, or simply faked. So let's see what the Russian doctors themselves had to say then. In 1892, the doctors of the Vladimir Governorate gathered to discuss necessary measures to prevent a new wave of cholera. The Vladimir Governorate is the very center of Russia, geographically and historically. It is the truest and purest Russia there is. So here is what the Doctors' Congress noted. In the Vladimir Governorate, I remind you, this is the end of the 19th century. In the Vladimir Governorate, there are almost entire administrative districts that rely exclusively on stagnant, thawed pond water for drinking. In simpler terms, people drank water from large puddles. And if drinking from ponds doesn't strike you as it did the governorate's doctors, it's probably because you imagine something like alpine ponds instead of this. This is, for example, a pond in the town of Melenki in the Vladimir Governorate. In places where wells serve as water sources, they are often kept in very poor conditions. Peasant yards most often represent a typical dumping ground for all sorts of filth. All the described conditions are significant factors in the spread of epidemics, and addressing them is a matter of utmost necessity. It is the end of the 19th century in the center of Russia, and the local government's most crucial and urgent task is to teach its people not to drink from puddles, but at least from minimally sanitary conditioned wells. But okay, this is the Vladimir Governorate, just simple man, small folks living in houses with yards representing dumping grounds for all sorts of filth. What was the situation in the capital of the Russian Empire, in St. Petersburg? Oh, by the way, do you know when the Russian capital introduced its first plumbing system? In the Roman Empire, the first plumbing system appeared more than 2000 years ago, but in Russia... So in 1846, Count Essen Stenbock-Fermor came to St. Petersburg and thought it was urgent to save the inhabitants of the Russian capital. He built a water pump and the first plumbing system in St. Petersburg on Znamenskaya, Italianskaya and Sergeyevskaya streets. However, his business failed because no one wanted to connect to his plumbing system. He naively thought that people would connect to it, but no one did. Why bother with plumbing and pay for it when water carriers roamed the city delivering water in dirty barrels? And so they continued to live this way. It wasn't until 1863 that the plumbing system was introduced again, but only in certain parts of the city. Plumbing coverage then slowly grew, and by 1900, according to the city's report, about 70% of St. Petersburg houses had access to the water supply system. Great, the plumbing system was finally built, but where did they get the water from? In August 1908, a severe cholera epidemic broke out in St. Petersburg, infecting 9,000 people and resulting in 3,820 deaths. The following year, cholera killed 3,200 people and 1,800 more in 1910. Again, this is the year 1910 that we're talking about. Airplanes are already flying in the sky, the Ford Model T is in mass production, electric vacuum cleaners and washing machines exist, and yet the capital of the Russian Empire was once again facing a cholera epidemic. Conditions in the city were so bad that on February 17, 1909, the Russian Empire's Council of Ministers, led by Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, convened to address the crisis. The council noted, among the major European cities, St. Petersburg ranks high in mortality and morbidity rates. Moreover, a third of all deaths in the city are due to infectious disease such as typhoid fever, which factually never ceases in St. Petersburg. This extremely unfavorable sanitary condition is due to many reasons, but primarily the lack of a sewage system and the poor quality of drinking water. The intake points of the city's water supply are located on the Neva River and its branches within the city limits. Upstream from these intake points are densely populated areas and a number of factories, plants, public baths, and hospitals that freely discharge their waste into the same Neva River. Thus, the accumulating filth in St. Petersburg essentially isn't removed, but rather continuously cycles from homes into Neva and back into residence apartments through the water supply system. But okay, these were the common people. Besides the commoners, there was also the high aristocracy, the Russian Tsar, his family, and his mother, Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. In 1910, the royal family's doctor, alarmed by new cholera outbreaks in the capital, reported to Empress Maria Feodorovna that all the tableware washed with water from the city's plumbing system, that is, the dishes in the Emperor's palace, is covered with bacteria of all kinds of diseases, especially relapsing fever. Meanwhile, the kitchen uses ice that comes from a storage facility near the Tavritsky Palace, located next to the infectious disease department of the palace hospital. It is from there that 2 carts of ice are delivered daily, and even by its appearance, the ice is dirty. A big conflict then started between the Council of Ministers and the city government over who was responsible for the situation in the capital and whether the city or state budget should cover the expenses. A large state commission then was created to enforce the sanitation of St. Petersburg. In 1912, this commission reported that the soil of St. Petersburg is currently literally saturated with all kinds of miasmas. The drain pipes from cesspits lead to storm drains running under the streets. These storm drains are intended only for atmospheric precipitation, but in reality, all homeowners discharge cesspit fluids into them. When workers dig up the soil on the streets, there are cases of fainting from the stench. Conflicts between branches of power continued, however, the situation did not change a bit. By 1917, the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, which marked the end of the Russian Empire, the Russian capital still had neither a well-functioning sewage system nor clean water free from bacteria. As George Dobson, a British journalist of the Times newspaper in Russia, described in one of his books, St. Petersburg was probably the only city in Europe, or perhaps in the world, where the whole city was covered by various warning signs warning people against drinking raw water. However, even those precautions didn't help much, as regular people saw in cholera nothing else but the infernal doings of the devil or the diabolical work of the doctors. To remind you, this is the 20th century already, which seemed to have little to no effect on yet another so-called Russian traditional value, the population's blatant ignorance in matters of public and personal hygiene. And again, these are not my words, but the impressions of those who lived or visited Russia at that time. And now I think would be a good time to draw a line and make some conclusions. So Russia, the one that existed for 155 years from the accession of Catherine the Great up to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, this particular 5 million population Little Russia indeed represents one of the most vivid and successful historical examples of rapid catching-up development. The history of this Russia in a way anticipated the history of countries like South Korea or Taiwan and other countries whose rapid development in the 20th century was primarily based on adopting Western technology and science available at the time. In this sense, the 155-year history of Russia is essentially no different from the history of modern South Korea. In the case of Russia, it was the Germans who came and brought with them their German administration, German scientists, explorers, and architects. This little 5 million strong Russia managed to absorb this civilization, process it, and use it for its own development, progressing at an astonishingly high pace, by the standards of that time, of course. This little Russia at the beginning of the 19th century spoke French in everyday life and German in professional and scientific areas, and by the end of the very same 19th century it was indeed among the world leaders in science, technology, art, literature, music, you name it. With incredible speed, this country was catching up with the civilized world. The question, of course, is how long such a high pace could have been maintained. But this little Russia was indeed, if not among the top 10 most developed countries, then certainly quickly approaching it. However, another truth is that the wagon cannot outrun the horse, and thus during these 155 years, Russia was never a pioneer or leader in any area. And the second truth is that, apart from this little civilized country, there was also another vast Russia inhabited by the remaining 95% of the population, whose distance from the Russian capital was measured not in miles, but in decades of cultural development. Western culture and values reached this main part of Russia very slowly and were adopted just as slowly, if at all. As the French Marquis de Custine noted in his famous book about Russia, the common Russians suffered from both the evils of barbarism and civilization at the same time. Marquis de Custine, who visited and traveled through Russia for several months, described this country and its social nature so accurately that it's no surprise his book was then banned in the Russian Empire and, interestingly enough, even in the USSR. Some of de Custine's observations are so relevant that one could easily reprint his book with the date changed from 1839 to 2024, and they would still give a perfect description of Russia and its people. But that will be the topic for one of the next videos, and if you want to be the first to watch them, join me on my streaming service Nebula. That will also be the best way to support this channel and its future development. As I'm sure you know, YouTube's current policies as regards channels covering history are quite harsh. YouTube is more interested in the comfort side of the viewer's experience rather than its educational side, which, if we are talking about real history, can be brutal, and thus YouTube limits the visibility of such historical videos. But that's exactly why we need to learn history, so as to possibly prevent such horrible events from repeating themselves again. As YouTube's policies won't likely change anytime soon, that forces creators like myself to make quite a hard choice, either pick safe or less compelling topics that align with YouTube's algorithm, or cover the important subjects while taking the big risk that such videos will possibly lose monetization. And for sole creators like me, who are not big studios with huge production budgets, making such a choice is extremely hard. especially for this channel, as the history of Russia, which I plan to cover, is a non-stop chain of disasters that were always kept secret from people. Fortunately for me, I have Nebula, which isn't like other streaming platforms, as it was built and owned directly by us, the creators, making it the most sustainable way to support our work. When you sign up with my link in the description, I will get a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you are subscribed. With a Nebula subscription, you will always watch my videos first, before they are released on YouTube. On top of that, you will get access to exclusive videos from my second channel, only on Nebula, which covers aviation history, such as the story of the ghost flight when a Soviet transport aircraft circled for several hours over a city with an entirely unconscious crew, or the story of the Soviets' crazy attempts to install gigantic guns on small fighters, or the video on the Russian art of military cheating. And not just my videos, as Nebula houses dozens of unique exclusive projects like Red Atoms by Real-Time History, Underexposure by Neo, Modern Conflicts by Real-Life Lore, along with many more projects which, if not for the support of Nebula subscribers, wouldn't be possible, since it's too risky to produce them for YouTube due to its strict advertising policies. On Nebula, creators don't need to worry about that, simply because there are no ads or sponsorship messages there, which is why the number of such exclusive videos is growing every day. You can get access to Nebula with my link in the description, which gives you an amazing 40% off on an annual subscription, bringing the cost down to just $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. Sign up using my link to get 40% off an annual subscription and support Comrade Kroupsky. And as always, thank you so much for watching.